So for that teacher, the teacher that gives the grammar lectures, the teacher that gives the vocabulary lists, really what they would be doing is they would be accessing the monitor. And what Krashen says is that the ideal teacher, the ideal classroom for students to master a language would focus on the LAD, the language acquisition device. So in other words, the ideal classroom would not be about vocabulary lists, would not be about grammar lectures. It would be exposure to ideas, exposure to content that's interesting, that's motivating, that students want to learn about. They want to read about it. They want to hear about it. They want to talk about it. And it's all done in the target language. So this is almost exactly the opposite of what grammar translation was suggesting. This is a focus on being exposed to the language. In fact, with Krashen's method, many people have interpreted it as a complete exposure in the language. From the moment a student walks into the classroom, everything is done in that first language. Not everybody interprets it that way. In fact, even Krashen himself has argued that often the first language can act as a way to make input comprehensible. So it can act as another way for students to check their understanding. So his idea of the ideal classroom is a rich classroom of listening and reading and seeing things acted out before students with lots and lots of ways to make sense of it. The ideal classroom would not focus on the grammar lectures and on vocabulary lists. So it would not try to access that really kind of conscious learning that you'd carry out with the monitor. So essentially, he said there's a difference between acquisition and learning. There's a difference. And what we want for our classrooms is acquisition. That's what he argued. So once you get all the way through here, whether you've ideally gone through the language acquisition device by providing amazing learning environment with lots of comprehensible input and a very low effective filter, if you access, whether you're accessing through the LAD or you're going through conscious learning, memorization with the monitor, eventually you have output. Now, it probably seems pretty cut and dried. That seems very simple. Of course, you start with input, and at the end you get output. But really, if you think about especially grammar translation and audiolingualism, especially audiolingualism, the belief was that students needed to produce immediately what they were learning, otherwise they weren't learning. In other words, if you teach a grammar lesson and you give students 25 sentences to translate, if they can't translate them immediately, there was no learning. There was no taking in of the language. With audiolingualism, if you teach a new set of vocabulary and students are carrying out the script, if they can't produce in the script applying what you've just taught immediately, there wasn't learning. What we have here is we have an understanding that there's a lot going on in the brain before you get to output. And even though audiolingualism and grammar translation were entirely obsessed with output, right? Could you translate those sentences? Can you participate in that script, in that dialogue? Krashen is focused here on intake. Input leading to comprehensible input, leading to a low effective filter, leading to intake. So for Krashen, students didn't need to talk. Students didn't need to write. That wasn't the focus of what was going on. And so it's also, out of this method, was the first time that we started to pay attention to something you've already been exposed to, and that is the silent period. The silent period. Because Krashen's ideas opened up this idea that you know, even if students aren't talking, maybe they're still taking in language. Maybe there's still some movement forward in their proficiency. And once that idea came out, a researcher named Seville Troiki started to do research with young children around the silent period. And the fact that some children would exit the silent period with quite a lot of language that they could produce, like I gave you an example of a student I worked with who produced complex sentences immediately when she did begin to speak. That was used as evidence that look what's going on, even if you're not hearing anything from the student. So this is a very radically different approach. Now, one thing I want you to know is that when Krashen first came up with this idea, he really demonized the idea of the monitor. And he said there was no place for it. He said there should be no grammar teaching at all. So that's Krashen 1.0. After a while, he started to rethink those ideas, and he started to recognize, as I do, that students come to us with very different educational backgrounds, very different backgrounds in how they've begun learning English already, and they also come with different personalities. We looked at those individual differences. Some students have a very low tolerance of ambiguity. They want the answer, they want it now. They want to understand the grammar point. Other students, they're more amenable to taking risks and living with some ambiguity of not knowing. And so he recognized that personality, educational background, the previous ways that language were taught, that they might call for the monitor to enter the classroom at times. So Krashen 2.0 is a little bit of grammar if it's appropriate. And that's where I fall to. So anyway, so here we have this amazing model, and it really did radically change our field. And there are pieces of it that have never really been proven. When I was in your shoes, I became really focused and fascinated with some ideas that come out of the language acquisition device. For example, one of the things that Krashen said was that there is, for every student, that there is a natural order in which they will learn things. And so, again, he's kind of taking apart the myth that if you're just an amazing teacher, if you provide just the right input, that it will automatically cause certain changes in the student. He said, not so fast, because there's actually within learners, and he did generalize, so in other words, all students finding their way through the pathway of English, all students attempting to acquire French, for example, that there will be a natural order that the students learn grammar in. So, for example, if you say to yourself, okay, last week I taught the students present tense, so this week I'm going to teach past tense, and you come up with amazing activities, and you present the students with lots and lots of evidence to access their LAD, and you are triggering the monitor by having some mini grammar lessons because you're following Krashen 2.0. Well, if the students aren't ready to know past tense, they won't learn it. It won't happen. And that's what he was saying with this. And when I was in your shoes, when I was a student, that fascinated me. And so I wanted to know. I was beginning to teach grammar. I wanted to know, what's the optimal order? What is it? No one had given it to me. I wanted to design my syllabi around it. And I was really discouraged and a little frustrated and disappointed that not a whole lot of studies were able to point to any kind of order at all. So what we tend to see when you go out and you see classrooms in which grammar is taught explicitly, and that means grammar rules are actually named rather than just modeled. So when students' monitor is being accessed, you'll see that present tense does come before past tense, and past tense comes before present perfect. But those aren't coming out of this hypothesis. They're just coming out of our intuition about what can most easily be learned by students at different stages. So this is kind of ground zero for our most recent ideas. And the other methods I want to talk about, they also tie into this. So I'm going to use the same focus here. So the next method that I want to talk about is TPR, total physical response. Now, the way that total physical response works is a teacher prepares a set of commands for a class. Maybe the teacher wants to work on the classroom vocabulary, and the teacher wants to work on basic verbs of movement. So the teacher comes up with a list like, and I have a chair here, but you can't see it. There we go. Walk to the chair. Touch the chair. Push the chair. Sit in the chair. Stand up from the chair. Push the chair away. That is total physical response, because as the students are hearing the language, they're seeing the movements at the same time modeled by the teacher. And what happens is, as students begin to understand the movements, they start doing it too. And as soon as a student in the class is ready to lead, a student comes up and they lead the movements. Stand up, sit down, touch the chair, push the chair, sit down in the chair. And so they take over. Now, doesn't that sound a little familiar? What does that remind you of? The series method, right? Remember our Frenchman, who's the teacher of Latin, who goes to Germany, and he, disappointed, goes back home because he magically didn't learn German in 4 weeks by memorizing huge amounts of vocabulary. He goes home and he finds that his nephew is speaking in French. And he notices how his nephew moves through the world using language. And it's basically a series of sentences with connected verbs and connected nouns. And that really is what TPR is doing. It's really the same thing. But TPR came out, the fellow who created TPR was actually a friend of Krashen's. And so what he was looking for is he was looking for a new pathway to make input comprehensible to students. And so it was, as he was reaching for a different way other than just realia, just images, as he was thinking about how to act things out, he came up with this method. And I bet all of us have been exposed to it at some point. So there's TPR. And also related, in the same way, is what's called the silent way. Now, this one's going to sound a little hokey, but hang with me. Okay, so the silent way was created by someone. I think you can see this. I have a basket full of rods here. They're colored rods. They were originally used in mathematics teaching, and they're called Cuisenaire rods. Well, someone in language teaching decided that as we're thinking about how to make input comprehensible, and as we're thinking about how the language acquisition device could just absorb patterns without really having to think about them, that language teacher turned to these rods to begin to lay out sentences in patterns or to show grammatical patterns. So the way it might work is you might do something like this. Let me grab a couple. You might say, and most of the time, teachers would be doing this on a table with all the students surrounding or using an overhead projector. So here I've got a purple rod, and I might say, cat. And maybe I've got a picture of a cat. Then I show a picture of two cats, and I say, cats. Now, I don't explain that this is the S. I don't explain plural. I don't stop and give any grammar lesson at all. I let the students begin to absorb that that's what the plural is. So maybe I move on to another. Maybe I say table, tables. And I'm either gesturing to multiple tables or I've got a picture of different tables. Now notice I'm not saying much at all. Like TPR, I'm just saying very simple things. I'm keeping what I'm saying to the students, I'm keeping it very simple so that they can, the focus is that comprehensible input so they can understand it. So I might say computer, computers, right? Here's the key with Silent Way. As soon as someone is ready to take over with the rods, and often it's done on a table with all the students around, the teacher backs away and the students take over. And often it's the students providing feedback to each other. If someone says, computer, someone will say, no, 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 computer, computers, right? And so there's almost kind of a simplified language being used. So Silent Way, it sounds a little hokey because you've probably never even been in a classroom where someone's used rods like that consistently, not just as a novelty one day, but every day. But, you know, there's a key idea there that I use in my teaching, and that is to think really carefully about the language I'm putting in front of students. It's possible to say too much. It's possible to muddle things by presenting students with way too many words. So it challenges me to think about what I'm going to say, and could it be made even simpler? And then also to model for students, and then as soon as students are ready to take over, to be quiet. And that it's very possible that that method, even though I hardly ever use Cuisenaire rods, that method has impacted me quite a bit. Now, I haven't used Cuisenaire rods with students very much, but let me tell you an example of a way that I did use the idea of Cuisenaire rods with a level 5 grammar class that I was teaching in the English Language Institute. I had a group of students, mostly males, a few females, from Saudi Arabia and from China, and the students were really struggling with, when we form a question, how we move words around, and adding, if it's past tense, adding did, why did, who did that, right, that sort of thing. And so they were struggling with those pieces. And finally one night, I started thinking about Silent Way, started thinking about the rods. And what I did was I created questions using different colors behind. So I used construction paper. So all the dids were on purple paper, for example. All the whos were on pink paper or whatever. And so when the students came in, I didn't say anything. And I had a question up on the board. And then I put up another question. And then I put up another question. And then I took them down. And I put up the statement that you could make a question from. Then I put up the question word below it and modeled taking from that sentence, moving those pieces down, those colored pieces, moving them down, all without, I didn't say a word. This was the beginning of class. Then, as soon as I could see that someone understood, I invited them up. I put up another sentence, another question word, and I let them take over. And they got it. And then I invited others to come up. And even though it was still a little shaky for them, with a partner, with the class participation, they were able to do it. So, might sound a little hokey, it actually is, there's some good ideas there. Okay, now we're on the home stretch. We have one more big idea to look at. And this big idea was really, I think, born when Chomsky's idea about linguistic competence, this idea that we just naturally have this ability to learn language, and we have this ability to produce language and to take it in and make sense of it. with that idea, a fellow named Del Himes came up with a different but a related idea, and it's communicative competence. Communicative competence. And there will be some readings that follow up on this after this video. And basically what the idea was is that let's rethink what it is that someone actually needs to be able to do to master language. What does it mean? If somebody can use language, what do we really mean by that? And we've kind of played with that question just a little bit, but now we're really going to address it. So what communicative competence really meant was, and I'll just put it up here as CC, what it really meant was that yes, grammar is part of it. Most of the previous language teaching methods before Krashen's method really focused on the grammatical. And grammatical here, it means a little more than grammar. It means the building pieces of language. It's that structural approach. So it's both grammar and vocabulary. Sometimes grammatical is called structural or linguistic. I bet you just love that there's multiple names for this, but at least you'll know, because I know at least linguistic you'll encounter even in the readings that I give to you for this unit. So yes, indeedy do, Del Himes said, yes, grammar is part of what someone needs when they use language, but that's not all of it. They also, sorry, I had a spelling problem. Trying to spell sociolinguistic, sociolinguistic. So this is the second thing that is needed, sociolinguistic competence. So in other words, you need to know how to change your language for the context, how polite to be. And we've kind of looked at that in other ways a little bit. So that should strike you as true. Of course we need to know how to do that, right? And you also need strategies. You need strategic competence. Someone who can use language well, when they come upon a word they don't know, they have some tools in their repertoire. They can skip the word, they can guess, they can use their favorite dictionary to look it up, they can ask someone, use that social strategy. There's lots of different strategies that really proficient users of language use. And there's one more. Discourse competence, which is, you're going to love me for this, is also sometimes called rhetorical. So discourse or rhetorical means the same thing. So what does this refer to? Well, if you're writing a letter to your grandmother and as you're thinking about that letter, you'll be thinking about the vocabulary and how to spell it that you want to use. You'll be thinking about which tense to use. You'll want to use past tense if you're telling grandma about something that happened in the past. You'll be thinking about your relationship with your grandmother. Maybe it's very formal, and so your letter will be very formal. Or maybe she is the person on earth that you were the closest to, and you can be very, very informal with her. And so you'd be making those choices. What will you do if you come to something you want to say and you can't think how to say it? If you can resolve that, you move through. You'd also be thinking about the simple things of how does a letter begin? What does the middle look like? What do people typically say at the end, right? Dear Grandma, I am fine, how are you, right? That's the way most letters to Grandma start. And how does a formal letter end? Sincerely, right? How does an informal letter, maybe to your grandmother, end? It would often end with saying something like, with love, or love, something like that. So what we have is we have this idea that the learning of language is really more than just learning grammar. And so this idea of communicative competence was developed into a method. And this is the communicative method, what I call the communicative method. And with the communicative method, there were lots of ideas about how to help students kind of bring alive language. And if we expect students to develop all of these, translating sentences, doing dialogues is not going to get you there. Students need to create with language. Students need to interact with each other. You need role plays. You need problems to solve. That's called task-based or problem-based learning. So out of this instinct and this belief, this hypothesis that knowing a language is about far more than just knowing the grammatical parts, was this idea that we need to bring language use alive for students in our classroom. So the communicative method grabbed onto this and focused in a lot of different ways on ways that we could get students actually interacting in the classroom. And out of those ideas about getting them interacting in the classroom, there were a couple of related ideas. And one of them is called noticing. So noticing is, take a look, so we start here with input, move to intake, and then to output. So noticing is an idea that basically students are comparing their intake with their output. And they're comparing what other students around them are producing versus what they produce. So let's stop here for a moment. Now we've taken Krashen's method that focuses entirely on input. You could have students not producing a word in one of Krashen's natural approach classrooms and things would be just fine. But the communicative method, if students aren't producing language, something's wrong. You actually do need to be producing output. But this is not output like audiolingualism, where you're producing certain sentences with perfect punctuation and you're producing sentences that someone else has written. You're reading a dialogue, how are you? I am fine. Even though you're sick with a flu, you have to say, I am fine, because that's what the dialogue says. Not the communicative approach. As students are comparing what they're hearing around them with what they are producing, these are created sentences, not scripts. These are produced just by the students themselves. So maybe the teacher gives the students a problem to solve, and they can only solve it in the first language, so they need to stay in the first language, and that's very easy to do in a classroom where no one has a shared first language. It's easy to do that in English. And they are comparing what others around them are producing with what they're producing. And the idea is that if they notice this difference, that they will start to change their ideas about how the language works. And so we go back to this idea of inner language, back to this idea of, as you're noticing that your partner is saying something a little bit different than you are, that maybe something about your language needs to change. Or maybe as your teacher is acting out a role play and carrying out a task in front of the class, and you hear your teacher's language, and you hear that your teacher did it a little bit differently than you did. You start to notice that difference, you zone in on that, you take a step forward in your language development. So there's one more piece that I think is key before I let you go about the communicative method, and that is another term called negotiation of meaning. So I'm going to put it right here. And again, it's part of this, a disparity between what's coming in and what's coming out. But this is focused more exclusively on students' output. So here's how it might go. That if I'm learning Spanish, if you're learning Spanish too, I say something to you, you don't understand me, so I think about it. I try it a different way, you still don't understand me. Think about it. I try it a third way, you understand me. We just negotiated meaning, and that meant that I had to rethink what I thought was true about how Spanish works, at least in this little tiny way. And that is negotiation of meaning. And there'll be an example for you that happened with me with a student years ago that I think is a great example of negotiation of meaning for you to take a look at. So we just had a whirlwind tour of the most recent methods that most impact our classrooms right now. And I bet as I was talking, you could in your mind imagine a lot of classrooms that you've seen in action, maybe even recently. So we grounded all of these ideas in Krashen's idea of the natural approach. From there, we showed how TPR and the silent way were really just kind of offshoots. They were coming out of that. And then we saw how Delheim's thinking about communicative competence led us in a different focus, and that is a focus on the output of students and how there needs to actually be students communicating in the classroom so that they can notice how their language is a little different from others, and so they are forced to try to make meaning with what they're trying to say. Woo! Whirlwind tour, but you've got lots and lots of concepts and terms that you can impress your friends at parties with. Okay, so there'll be a whole host of things to read and view and watch after this.